All right. So welcome, Nadia. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us in Washington last night. I loved your book. I know lots of the ladies loved your book. So we were really thrilled that it was an official GBC choice for February. Uh, I have lots of questions for you, and I will go ahead and just dive right in. And anybody who has a question, as I said before, you can just write it in the chat on the right-hand side, or if you want to raise your hand, then I will certainly ask you immediately as soon as I possibly can. But the first question, kind of to kick things off, is, so Nadia, you've written many historical novels, and can you discuss for a moment the process and research involved in writing a novel so that it's historically accurate, if that is indeed important to you?
It is important to me, and I'm glad to be able to answer your questions. Thank you all for reading the book and sticking with it, because I know it can be a tough read for some, since a lot of it is steeped in what's actually happening in the world today. And then there's also a part of the story that is more of a historical fiction aspect. So for me, in composing the story, because I wanted to talk about the real issues that Afghanistan is facing, and because I wanted to be truthful to the history of Afghanistan and kind of introduce that history to some people who may not have known about this chunk of time in Afghanistan's past, I wanted to stay authentic, and I wanted to stay true to actual events and actual figures. So while the main characters are fictional characters, the backdrop for the story and the people that they are sort of intersecting with are actual people in Afghanistan's history. Now, I've taken liberties with the things that they say, but I've tried to stay true to their characters and to their motivations and their actions. So in terms of doing the research, I mean, the historical aspect of it was actually a lot of fun for me. I like history, and it was fun for me to be able to dig into Afghanistan's past and start to pick apart, you know, how did this country go from where it was 100 years ago to a place where my mother in the 1960s to early 70s was graduating as a civil engineer in Afghanistan and having the freedom to work outside of her home, and then all of a sudden going back into a very dark time. So in order to be able to trace that, I wanted to, you know, look at the footsteps and work my way backwards. So I use, there's an archaeologist slash anthropologist who did extensive research in Afghanistan along with his wife, so the Dupree family. And they have actually archives that are still in Afghanistan. Louis Dupree has since passed away, but his wife is still active and working in Afghanistan and is part of, I believe, maintaining those archives. And so his texts were very useful in terms of, you know, outlining the specific history. When I talk about you know, the turnover from one king to another, it's fuzzy. Nobody really knows what actually happened there. So I was able to kind of introduce a little bit of conspiracy and not really provide answers, since we don't have any. I also used photographs. And so part of what I think the process was for me was looking at a black and white photograph and trying to immerse myself in that photograph and imagine what it would be like to walk down this street. I also had to make sure, when I talk about anything from the technology that's used at that time period, I wanted to make sure that I was authentic to it. And so I wanted to make sure that, you know, what kinds of transportation were being used at that time period in the country, and stay true to that. And it was reasonably easy to find the resources, and the fun part was just figuring out where in the story to insert them so I could paint that picture.
It's absolutely fascinating. And did you actually travel to Afghanistan to, like, I know you've probably been there because your mom was born there, but did you travel back, like when you knew you were going to write a book?
I didn't. So both my parents are from Afghanistan. I was born and raised in the United States, but I traveled to Afghanistan in 2002, absolutely not with the intention of writing a book. But of course, every experience stays with you, and there are things from that trip that I made that are definitely laced into the story as, you know, the backdrop. So when I walk through the streets of Kabul, then I can write about it as my experience, because really that's Rahima's. That's where Rahima is wandering around. And so those aspects, I wish I had known that I was going to write a book at that time, because I could have taken a lot more photographs, and I could have been a lot more diligent in my research. But between family members and my experience there and kind of piecing it all together, it managed to come out.
Okay, fair enough. The next question actually we have is from Jennifer. And Jennifer says that this is a question that came up at Actual Book Club this week. And it was, why does the culture allow for a girl to pretend to be a boy, although the adults know that she is a girl, but they can't let her be a girl with masculine qualities?
So that's a great question. You know, the essence, and I guess I should give a little bit of backdrop to this practice. It's a practice that's done not by every family in Afghanistan, not by the majority of families in Afghanistan, but it seems like everyone's got a 1 degree of separation. So everybody kind of knows of one. Oh, there was one in my neighborhood, or there was one in my school, or something like that. The reason that the practice is actually still carried out is because it is a deeply patriarchal society, and there's a different value to having a son than there is to having a daughter. And so families who do not have a son feel that this is a solution for them. You know, the society has created this problem that, oh, if you don't have a son, we're going to, you know, look down on you or pity you. And so then there is this creative little solution, and so the society as a whole accepts it as well. These girls are allowed to pretend to be boys, and everybody goes along with the charade because it is socially acceptable as long as the girl is prepubescent, before the age of puberty. And you know, everybody understands that this is a temporary thing, but everybody's all in, so she can do whatever she wants to do as long as she is a boy, and she's 100% boy at that time. There is a superstitious belief that if you dress one of your daughters as a son, if you create a bacha posh in your household, that the next child naturally born into the household will be a true son. And, you know, statistically speaking, of course, when people go on to have their next child, like, there's a 50-50 chance of that superstitious belief playing out as true. But, you know, what happens is that there are roles, and you can't cross those roles. And so for a girl to have masculine qualities is deemed wildly inappropriate. But we understand that we've got this little loophole that we've created, and if that girl is pretending to be a boy, then she can do those things. And that really just falls in, because it's only justifiable because of those very clearly defined and different roles for the two genders in society.
Thank you. Another question that we have, and this is from Michelle. She wants to know a little bit about your inspiration for writing the book. And she's also asked, as a fictional tale, where did you get your insight into the life of Afghan women? And I mean, I think you've answered that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, you know, the inspiration for this story really was as I was growing up. So I mentioned to you that my mother grew up in Afghanistan. When I look at the black and white pictures of my mother growing up, of her and her sisters around the time that they were in college or a little bit beyond, they are wearing the kinds of clothing that I'm wearing. So they had choices. They each decided what they wanted to study at the university. When they finished the university, they went off and got jobs. They chose who they wanted to marry. And so when I see that, and here I am growing up in the United States, and then I'm watching the news with my parents and watching Afghanistan sort of spiral into decay and disorder, and then 1996 comes around, I'm graduating high school, setting off to college with, you know, all the options laid out for me, and parents who are encouraging me to pursue whatever I want to do. And it's the same year that the Taliban come into Afghanistan and take control and shut down the schooling for girls completely, and really ban women from engaging in the public sphere or being visible at all in society. So all of this is something that I've been thinking about for so long, thinking, how could this have happened? How outraged am I that my counterparts have a complete lack of opportunities? And, you know, how fortunate am I that just because I happen to be born in the United States, that I have escaped that kind of fate, which, I mean, it could easily have been my fate as well, to not have any of the opportunities that I had. So when I wanted to sit down and write a story, I mean, there's nothing more important to me than talking about this and understanding how this happened to Afghanistan, how Afghanistan's trying to recover from it, and, you know, is something like this possible? We know, what lessons can we learn from it, even in our own backyards, really?
There's some very, very strong characters in the book. And how did you decide to write between the two generations, or like between Rahima and, I'm gonna not say the
Shikeba.
Shikeba, yeah. How did you decide that jumping back and forth, like, what did you hope to achieve with that?
When I came across the black and white photograph of the king's harem, the guards for the king's harem, and these were women dressed as men because he didn't trust men to guard his harem. And I already had in mind that if I wanted to talk about gender inequality in Afghanistan, the perfect character, the perfect vehicle for that conversation would be a bacha posh, as a child who has lived as both. And when I saw the picture and I realized, there are two different time periods in Afghanistan's history that a girl or a woman has dressed as the opposite gender, and how that changes her circumstances and how it alters her fate. So I thought it would be cool to connect that concept through history as well. And then it just seemed natural for me to kind of jump back and forth. And one of the connecting factors was also that in Afghan culture, legacy is incredibly important. And one question that you always ask people is like, well, when you meet someone, well, who are your parents? Who's your grandfather and who's your great grandfather? And so that concept of going back to your history, and a lot of people who are nothing today may actually stand tall and proud because of the legacy of whatever their great grandfathers may have done. And so that's the reason that I wanted, to introduce that concept through Rahima constantly looking back to her great-great-grandmother's story and truly gaining some inner strength from it, and to reinforce how important it is to have that kind of history in your own family too.
In your view, do you think that things actually got worse for women in Afghanistan from one generation to the next, the two that you're comparing?
I think that in the Taliban time period, that was absolutely the bleakest. And that's not really 100% my opinion, but in speaking to women who lived through Afghanistan and people who look at the history more, it seems like the Taliban time period was truly those were the darkest days for women in Afghanistan. I believe it was actually a female parliamentarian that I met with in Australia this past summer who said that those were really, really the darkest days, and she lived in Afghanistan during that time period. I think what we see in Shakeba's time period is sort of a natural progression. So I always think of it as if we compare what was happening in the United States or anywhere in the West at the same time, right, it may not have been absolutely the same as what Shakeba's situation was, but in terms of, the laws and what women could or couldn't do in society, you can see that there would be more parallels. And then, when we look at the 50s and 60s, I think about it, when my mother was in civil engineering school, that she was one of few women to be in that program. And I would bet that in the United States at the same time, there were not that many women in the engineering field. And that's why we've got this big push for it. But really, once you hit the 80s and Afghanistan really goes into an official state of war and then completely falls downward and downward, the big losers during those periods of unrest are the women. And so they really lose everything and hit rock bottom between 96 and 01. And I think after that, they're starting to come back up. So it's hard to say, who had it truly worse off, Shakeba or Rahima. I think there are probably a little bit more opportunities in Rahima's time period. And also women in Afghanistan have had a taste of a much better experience. They've had that highlight, that golden time. And so I think that's why the women of today are fighting harder for their rights. It's because they've had it before.
Right. And kind of on the same topic, we have a question from Laura, who said that this came up in book club last night, and they wondered what the exact time period between the two women when they were alive, what that was.
It's about 100 years. So Shakeba was born sort of at the turn of the century. Rahima's story is around 2007. Obviously, it's a sort of a chunk of time of her life, but they're around 100 years apart.
And a question from Ruth here is, she wants to know if the same stigma is still going on in the country and how steep it is.
The stigma, I guess the stigma of being a bacha posh, or I'm not sure which stigma.
I'm not sure either. Ruth, if you can just explain, or kind of Yeah. If you can explain that in the chat, then we can ask Nadia in a second. I'll go on to the next question. And
Okay.
this is, yes, there is a question here, but Sophie has said, some of my friends want me to make sure to tell Nadia that this book is one of their favorite reads. The book has a sense of ownership where the father owns his unmarried daughters and husband owns his wives. Are there any developments in that, especially in the rural parts?
Well, thank you, Sophie and friends. There are, Afghanistan's a very diverse country, and what's happening in the cities is different than what's happening in the countrysides or in the villages. And then beyond that, what's happening in every individual family is also very different. Women and girls, they're taking on a very different role in society. So as more girls are being educated, as more women are standing on their own 2 feet, they're developing an economic value within their households and within their society and communities as well. So you have.
Ooh. I'm not sure if I'm frozen. Oh, yes, I am.